Well, so far the creed's been nothing but good news. It's good news to hear that the world we live in is made by a loving God. It's good news to know that that God has come among us, born of a woman. It's good news to know that that God has willingly endured suffering and humiliation and shame for our sakes. It's very good news to hear that that incarnate one has been raised up to live and reign in the glory of the Father. And then we get to this next line of the creed, and he will come to judge the living and the dead. And all of a sudden we feel as though the creed is, like one of those ads where it sounds like it's just all this wonderful stuff, and then you find out there's a really big, you've got to pay $50 a month for 3 years. We feel as though suddenly there's a catch. Judgment. I didn't see that coming. Is it bad news? Is it bad news to hear that Jesus Christ will come as our judge? Is the creed sort of a mixture of the good and the bad, and we're meant to, swallow both together? Is that what's going on here? Well, we do often think about judgment as a bad thing, as something sinister and dreadful. I remember as a boy going to Sunday school, I suppose, where they would warn you that one day every bad thought you've ever had is going to be on public display and you'll be judged. And it was a terrible thing to hear, and I remember going for walks and seeing in North Queensland, you get the most brilliant sunsets. It looks as though it's the end of the world. And I remember being horrified by the beauty of these sunsets, thinking, oh no, Jesus is coming back. All my bad deeds will be on display. I somehow got the idea that judgment is bad news, something to be morbidly afraid of. Well, what I want to try to help you to see this morning is that belief that Jesus Christ is coming as our judge is part of the good news of the gospel. That this is not a little bit of fear mixed in with the love. This is not a little bit of dread and horror mixed in with grace. The whole creed, the whole gospel is nothing but good news for us and for all people. And that belief in the last judgment is part of the joy of the gospel. I want to try to help you to see that this morning. Well, we've heard a reading from the Gospel of John that speaks of Jesus as judge. And in fact, one of the central themes running right through the Gospel of John is that Jesus comes into the world bringing judgment. But it's very interesting the way John talks about this. You heard the reading, John 3 verse 19, and this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and people loved darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. For all who do evil hate the light and don't come to the light. Judgment means, to judge is to discriminate. To judge is to separate. To judge is to make a distinction. If you think of a law court, a judge is a person who is able to discern the truth and then to act on it and to make a separation, to say, over here is guilty and over here is not guilty. Judgment always means to separate. And the Gospel of John does not portray Jesus as someone who is good to some people. He's shining his light and grace over here, and then he turns with a face of horror and anger towards others. The Gospel of John says Jesus is the light of the world, and that light shines on everyone. The same light shines on all people. But some people react differently to that light. The same light shines on all, but there are some who sort of walk out freely and gladly into the light, and there are others who screw their eyes shut and sort of cringe back in the darkness. If you've been in a dark room for a long time and someone flicks on the light, sometimes your first reaction is to close your eyes. There's something unwelcome about light if you're not used to it. Sometimes you cringe away from it, pull the covers over your head so you can't see. John's Gospel portrays Jesus as judgment in that way. He is nothing but light. He does nothing but shine. But some people willingly shrink away from that light. In John chapter 9, Jesus heals a man born blind, and the man who was blind can now see, and he worships Jesus. He loves Jesus. He is overwhelmed by the not just the physical light that he can now see, but the fact that Jesus is the true light, and he worships him. And there are others who condemn this man, who are hostile, who are full of bitterness. And Jesus says at the end of this whole story in John 9, he says, verse 39, after the blind man has worshipped him and the others have rejected him, the spiritual teachers have rejected Jesus, Jesus says, I came into this world for judgment, so that those who don't see may see, and those who do see may become blind. It sounds paradoxical, but you see what's happened. God has turned on the floodlights, and some people who were longing for light stepped out into the light and welcomed it. And some people, under the brightness of the same light, have shrunk back into the shadows and screwed their eyes shut and refused it. Here's the point, I think, of John's Gospel. It's not that Jesus is gracious towards some people and then full of wrath towards others. It's not that Jesus comes and says, I like you and I like you, but I don't like you and you because you've done bad things. Jesus, John's Gospel says, is full of grace and truth. There's nothing in him except the love of God. There's nothing shining out of him except grace. But that grace produces a separation in the way people respond to it, the way people react to it. Now, the great 2nd century church father, Origen, I'm trying not to be distracted by James, he's full of beans. Do you want to sit down and listen? Origen, he talked about, he was intrigued by all these passages that speak about judgment, all these passages that speak about a torment. You know, passages in the Bible that speak of a fire that torments some people after this life. Origen looked at all those passages and was very puzzled by it. And he said, you know what this must mean? He said, this couldn't mean that God is gracious towards some people and then sort of lights a match to burn other people. It couldn't mean that there are, in other words, he said that would mean there are two different gods. There's a good God full of grace and truth, and there's some kind of dark, horrible, torturer, tormenting sort of God who's punishing others. Origen says that can't be true. The whole creed falls apart if you start thinking that there are two different faces to God. That God could one day turn around and look completely different from the God we've met in Jesus. That can't be true. Jesus is the full expression of the character of God. God is exactly like Jesus. God, one of the New Testament writers says, is light, and in him there is no darkness at all, no shadow. So Origen says, if God's nothing but light, nothing but grace, nothing but love, how could it be then that some people experience this torment? And he says, well, it must mean, essentially he says, heaven and hell must be exactly the same place, experienced in two different ways. And Origen gives this example. He says, think of a classroom. If you're at uni, you'll sympathize with it, you'll understand this one. Think of a classroom where the lecture is going on a bit long, and some people in that class are absolutely enraptured by the joy of learning and discovering. They're hanging on every word. They feel as if this class could go on forever, and they just are soaking in the knowledge. Then right next to them is another person who is tired and needs to go to the toilet and has got a headache, and every word the lecturer says is like a nail getting hammered into their skull, and they just can't wait to get out of there. Origen says in a classroom like that, both people are experiencing the same thing, and they're both in the same place. But one of them is in an experience of joy, and the other is as if consumed by a fire on the inside. And he says that must be what heaven and hell are. It must be God's love, God's grace, God's light shining. But if you're unaccustomed to it, if you don't like it, if your heart is somehow closed to love, if your heart is shriveled and dry and isn't used to drinking in God's goodness, then perhaps you experience love as a kind of torment, as a sort of fire. So that was Origen's way of trying to convey this sense in the Gospel of John, that when the light comes, it produces judgment. Not because of anything in Jesus, not because he is rejecting anybody, but because some people reject the light that he brings. Not because there's two different places, a place for the good people and a place for the bad people, but because the same self-giving expression of God's love produces different responses in us. I don't know if you find that helpful, but that's one of the ways that early Christians tried to struggle with this language about judgment and torment. And you can see their big commitment was to, let's make sure whatever we say about judgment, we don't end up with two different gods. The good God for the goodies and the bad God for the baddies. That would destroy the gospel. That would destroy the whole message of the New Testament. It would mean Jesus is just one of the things God is doing in the world. Now that's all very well and good, but we've still been talking about judgment as if it's all about separation between different groups of people, right? The people who respond to the light and the people who don't like it. The people who experience God's love in a heavenly way and the people who experience God's love as if it were hell. I think we can go a little deeper though. Because let me ask you this. Who are the good people and who are the bad people? If judgment is about separation, which one are you? Surely most of us would admit that we're a mixture of both, right? Is any of us just completely good, completely open to love, completely responsive to light and life and joy? Aren't we a mixture of both? And is anyone you've ever met really so completely twisted and self-enclosed and shriveled up on the inside that there's no light getting through at all? Is anyone either completely on one side of the fence or the other? Aren't all of us some kind of mixture of good and bad? Well, another one of the great early Christian thinkers, St. Augustine, was really, really puzzled by this. And he said, none of us can, not only are we a mixture of good and evil, if you think of two plants, two seeds planted side by side in the garden, and the two plants can grow up, maybe it's like a tomato plant and one of those weeds that looks like tomato, they can grow up so intertwined that you can't easily even tell the difference. And if you tried to separate them, you'd end up pulling up the good plant as well as the bad. And so Augustine said, well, God just lets the good and the bad keep growing up together until the end of the world, and then one day God will separate them. But he wasn't just talking about good and bad people, he was talking about our own lives. The good and the bad are growing up side by side in our lives. Just think of it. Haven't you ever made a really big mistake which turned out to be somehow glorious, somehow wonderful? Haven't you ever done something wrong that produced beautiful effects? The good and the bad were mixed up. There's just one example, there's people who have a failed marriage and they feel they had married the wrong person, and this whole part of their life was a big mistake. And yet the children brought into the world from that marriage were the best thing that ever happened to them. Well, was it a mistake or was it a blessing? Was it good or bad? Well, it was mixed. The plants are so closely intertwined that you can't even tell the difference. You can't even tell which is which. And think about the other side. Have you ever done something that you were so persuaded was right? You were acting in a sort of blaze of righteousness and goodwill, and you found out later that it was selfish. It was a proud thing to do. It injured someone else. It was all wrong. Have you ever looked back on your own good deeds and thought, the things I thought were best was actually the worst things I was doing? The things I thought were a mistake were the things that produced good fruit. Do you see what I mean? Augustine was intrigued by this. The good and the bad in our lives grow up so closely together that he said we can never, in any given case, we can never really tell the difference. We can never really tell for sure if what we're about to do is good or bad. It's too mixed up. What does that mean? Well, Augustine said, it means it's good news if one day, if it's not my job to separate the good and the bad from my life, if it's not my job to try and perfect my life, but simply to accept that the good and the bad are mixed up together. Every family is a good example of this. The things that are best and the things that are most painful in our lives, so close that you can't separate them. Well, Augustine says, if we accept that, and we trust that one day God will be the judge. God will separate what we can't separate and extract what's bad and leave the good so that our lives will actually become perfect and everything that we couldn't separate will be taken and thrown away in the fire. And so, St. Augustine said, the judgment that we long for is actually a blessing. The best thing that will ever happen to us is that one day Christ will be our judge. One day he'll come and extract all the good in our lives from all the bad. And for the first time in our lives, we'll really see the difference. For the first time in our lives, we'll be able to look at the good and rejoice. And we'll be able to look at the bad and accept that it's judged and that it's done away with. Our judgment will be our purification. Our judgment will be our deliverance. Do you see what I mean? Our judgment will be the greatest blessing that ever happens to us. So again, here we're talking not about a God who does two different kinds of things, blesses some people and judges and condemns others, but in our own lives, God brings a judgment which is itself part of grace. The judgment that we look forward to at the end of our lives is part of God's grace to us. It is part of the good news of the gospel that Jesus Christ will come to judge the living and the dead. Now, I think it's quite a countercultural idea to say that we look forward to judgment, to say that part of the good news for Christians is that there is a last judgment. But think about this. I mean, most people in our world, we kind of think we would like to be our own judges, right? We want to be completely separate. No one can judge me. It's a kind of a saying as well, don't judge me, you know. We don't like the thought that anyone would be our judge. But what happens once we lose this sense that at the end of life, someone else will be my judge? What happens when we lose that sense? Well, if you get any group of people, I'm trying really hard not to be distracted by my darling boy. I think he just wants to help me with the sermon. Do you want to carry the Bible for me and I'll tell you when I need it? That gives you an important job. You hold on to it and I'll tell you when I need it. Okay, so if there's some group of people in the world who think they have the right to judge, what's the result of that? Well, all of the worst totalitarian nightmares of the past century have been brought about in exactly that way. by some group of people who thought it was their job to separate the good from the bad, their job to cleanse the human race from impurities, their job to extract evil from good, darkness from light. And all of the great revolutionary nightmares of the past century have been brought about when a group of people thought it was their job to be the last judge. Down there. When we lose this vision that it is someone else who will judge us, then we start to think, well, maybe we should be the judges. And when you get any group of people in a society taking to themselves the right to judge the earth, you can be sure the streets will flow with blood before too long. The great wickedness that political orders are capable of is brought about when people forget that it is someone else who will judge us. And even just in our own personal lives, if I think I'm my own judge, if I think, well, no one's going to judge me except me, well, that might seem all very sort of grown up and it might feel good to be my own judge. But again, if it's my responsibility to extract the good from the bad in my life, if it's my responsibility to be able to discern and discriminate between the good and the bad, then my whole life long I'm going to be trying to perfect myself. My whole life long I'm going to be trying to make myself perfect, to purify myself, to cleanse myself. And don't we live in a society that's gripped by the fantasy that our own lives are perfectible? Isn't this part of where our societies become most destructive? That we think that the human body, for example, is something that you can sculpt to perfection, as if it would never die, as if it will never wear out and grow old. And if you go through life thinking of your body as something that's perfectible, then your whole life will be one great disillusionment after another. Or we think of our souls as things that are perfectible. All the little malfunctions that went wrong with us, or the big malfunctions that went wrong with us in our childhood. Through therapy and other techniques, we can eventually sort of craft our souls, heal our souls, make them perfect. And again, if we think our inner lives are perfectible, then our whole life will be one great disillusionment after another. If we take it upon ourselves to be our own judges, then we end up sort of paralyzed. We end up unable to live free and unself-conscious lives. We end up, haven't you ever been struck by the fact that our same society, which has this deep assumption that human life is perfectible, our same society is plagued by broken relationships, by anxiety, by depression. Life is just one big disillusionment and disappointment when we think that we are able to judge ourselves. The Christian vision that Christ will come to judge the living and the dead is a vision of a world that will never be perfect until the end. A world where God is content to let the good and the bad grow up together. And one day God will separate. God will make perfect what we cannot. And when we take that vision on board of a last judgment, that everything we do in our lives is heading towards the day when Christ will judge and Christ will separate. When we take that on board, here's what I think it does. It allows us to be patient. There are things in my own life that frustrate the hell out of me. But that's okay. That's part of what it means to be human. I'll be patient with myself. I'll forgive myself when I fail. Christ does not give me the authority to judge my own life. Christ will do that for me. So I'm able to be patient with myself, to put up with my own weaknesses and imperfections. Do you see what I mean? And I'm able to be patient with you, to put up with the things about you that disappoint me and frustrate me, because I'm not your judge, and you're just as mixed up as I am. But one day Christ will judge, Christ will separate. One day you'll experience that same cleansing grace that I'm longing for, when the good and bad are separated, and what's bad in us is thrown into the fire, and what's good is illuminated eternally by Christ's light. If we live towards a last judgment, then we're able to be patient with one another and patient with ourselves. And if we live towards a last judgment, we're able to be, how can I put this? We're able to be free just to go on living. If we're still living with the fantasy that human society is perfectible, then which institution are you going to get involved in working for? Which part of changing society are you going to get on board with? Because none of them work properly. No, which political party are you going to vote for? None of them are going to perfect this world. When we accept that Christ is the judge, this world is not perfectible. It means, well, in whatever small, provisional, unsatisfactory way I can, anything that's inching this world in the direction of righteousness and leaving behind some of the bad, I can get on board with that. I can serve institutions even though they're imperfect. I can work for peace and justice even though that peace is only ever partial and that justice is only ever incomplete. So it sets us free to be fully involved in this world without feeling that perfection has to be the goal. It's Christ who will bring the perfect transformation of this world into the place of peace and justice and righteousness. And here's the last thing. I'm going to stop with this. I hope you're not as restless as James is. At the end of the day, he will come to judge the living and the dead. Here's the main thing to keep in mind. It's the same Jesus Christ we're talking about. We're not saying, well, there was one person named Jesus who was born of a virgin, suffered, crucified, dead and buried, rose again. And then there's this other Son of God who's coming one day to judge us. It's not that. We're not dreading some other manifestation of the divine in our world. We're saying the same Jesus we meet in the Gospels, born of a virgin, the Jesus who feasted with sinners and tax collectors, the Jesus who was interested by outsiders, by the poor, the downcast and the oppressed, the same Jesus who, when he saw the woman caught in adultery, said, "Where are your condemners? Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." Same Jesus who liberates, who heals, who forgives all sins, he is coming again as our judge. What could be more comforting than the thought that this Jesus is the one who at the end will separate, will shine a perfect light, and all the darkness in our hearts and in our lives and all the darkness in our world will be cast out. That is good news. That is the good news of the gospel. He will come to judge the living and the dead. Thanks be to God. And so we are bound to God's word.